to direct you to page 33 of the report, section 1.8. Over the preceding 12 months, there has been a slight increase in the number of complaints. This is thought to be because of the increase in dog numbers within the city, which rose to 5.7%. It is pleasing to see the efforts to reduce barking, roaming, aggressive and rushing dogs through education has been successful, shown by the reduction in complaints in these areas. As you'll see in section 1.9, there has been a 12% increase in dog attacks. The contributing factors as to exactly why are unknown. We've spoken to other councils who have experienced an increase in dog attacks. With the dog attacks, it is noted that 3 serious attacks have been reported. Each attack was investigated. 2 of the 3 attacks, the dogs were surrendered to council and subsequently euthanised, addressing any ongoing public safety concerns. The 3rd attack on a person resulted in no action being taken, and that was simply because of the fact of the victim and the dog owner did not want to contribute to any investigation. Education is a key tool the animal management team uses to be proactive around dog attacks. On page 35, section 1.17, you'll see that we're continually working towards increasing education to the public around dog safety, which includes educating people on how to interact with other people's dogs, as well as how to handle their own dogs. We're happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Jason. I've got 2 questions to start with. The first one is around the data that is reported through, obviously this report through to central government. Is there a requirement to use the solid figures rather than percentages that might take into account the increase in dogs registered in a particular area, or report trends or any of that? Are you able to provide a comment on that aspect of the report, which is a little bit quiet?
Morning, Chair. Hopefully this provides the right answer for you. So on Appendix 2, the table that is presented there with all the numbers, that's the information that Section 10A asks for. The rest of the report expands on that to give some form of trend or explanation.
So when we talk about things like, I guess, dog attacks, because it's just a figure that on face value looks like there's been a significant increase, but there's also been an increase in, if there's been an increase in dogs registered, then that trend might not be as significant. I guess, where's the narrative around that? Or is it a little bit more of just a data-focused report?
It's more data-focused. I think that more relies on what happens in the community, what's reported to us, and how we can investigate and provide outcomes for what's reported.
Okay, thanks for that, Ross. And then just my second question is, if there is a attack on private property, possibly from a secured dog, is the outcome often different in your experience than if an attack happens in public spaces? In terms of how we manage it, whether it's a classification change or treatment of the dog?
So every dog attack's investigated on its own merits and individually. The type of control that a dog is in at the time is definitely considered. We try and look for our outcomes to match the offending and reoccurrences, if they are likely to happen or not, and what things we can put in place to try and limit or reduce those.
That answers the question. Yep. Thank you. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple of questions, just for my own understanding, which are on issues on page 34. So at 1.1, you're talking about infringements, and you'd say 15 were waived or cancelled because of extenuating circumstances. So I wonder if you could explain to me what kind of extenuating circumstances and what the decision-making process is around that.
So normally the infringements that will fall into that category are either a software glitch, as we hit save, it creates 2 records instead of 1. It might be that during our process there's been a slight error, like a date's missed on a compliance timeframe, or someone's made a payment that hasn't quite been receipted at the time of the infringement. So there's, a wide variety there. We do have...
Is that mostly administrative then, rather than because of people's circumstances?
Correct, yeah. We do have a process around applying to have your infringement waived and business rules there as well. In this report, I don't believe any of those are within that 15%.
Thank you for explaining that. And my second question was around 1.14, customer satisfaction. So we're reporting 63% satisfaction with roaming dogs, et cetera, et cetera. I think my question is, what's the trend there for customer satisfaction, and how does that compare with the national statistics on that?
So that information's taken out of the resident satisfaction survey. In terms of nationally, I'm not sure how we compare with roaming and barking dogs as such. We have internally noticed that there has been a reduction in roaming dogs, and the teams have been putting a lot of effort into education, trying to get there sooner to find the owner and educate them.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just wanting to follow on a bit from the Deputy Mayor's questions around the menacing dogs, I guess, or dangerous dogs, dog attacks, I suppose. Do we know if these are new dogs, or if they're older dogs, or if they're new dog owners? Do we have any of that kind of information?
Not to hand, it's attainable.
I was just, I guess the context behind that is I was wondering if the increase that we might have seen would be attributed to new dog owners getting puppies during the COVID period, and, not doing the socialization and those kind of things. So, do we know if that would have had an impact on our numbers?
I believe that the impact that COVID's had in the last 3 years on dogs and their owners has been rather significant. Auckland recently released an article explaining that as well, and the lack of socialisation, even in adult dogs, during the COVID period is being noticed now and will probably be noticed further into the future, through lack of socialisation, through expanding personal bubbles and then trying to reduce those again slowly.
Okay, cool. I think that's it for me. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Jason and Ross. I've got a few questions. My first question is around the table in Appendix 2 on the numbers. So you've helpfully provided the previous few years' numbers, but are those totals, for example, if we take the number of dogs classified as dangerous under Section 31, are those figures, so if we take this year, say 10, is that 10 new ones, or is that a cumulative total? Is that there's 10 in total of all of the registered dogs?
These are the total numbers of dangerous dogs within the city at the current time.
Okay. So, thank you. So, in that case then, my second question is around, there were 117 attacks, but we haven't, I assume that not all attacks result in a dog being classified, is that correct?
That's correct.
So, can you explain to us what happens if an attack's investigated and the dog's not classified? Is there some record kept of that for future assessment? If the dog offends again, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, so every dog attack that's reported to council is kept and linked against a dog and the owner. So if there's future attacks, we take history into consideration of both the owner and the dog, and that does impact the outcome of repeat offending if it occurs.
Okay, cool, thank you. Now, I know that this report is produced for a statutory purpose, but in previous years we have had, I guess, a lot more commentary around the stats. Have you had a chance to have a look at some of those previous reports?
Probably the past 2 years I've reviewed.
Okay. In order to get that additional commentary, which I think the chair was also sort of hinting at, would we need to give you some direction through council? Because I think just the figures on their own, without your interpretation of them, are a little bit hard, perhaps, for us to get a grip of. And to have, you know, so like the answer that you gave there to Councillor Dingwall, I think was a very helpful and useful observation, and would have been, it was a great question and answer, but that's the sort of thing that would be helpful for us to have in the report. So how do you need us to specify that, or is it enough just to sort of ask for it now, if you know what I mean?
I think that's helpful, so I think going forward we can definitely take that on board and provide a bit more commentary around the stats. I think the thing is we don't want to be providing sort of any anecdotal sort of commentary in there, so anything that we do provide needs to actually stack up with what we're seeing, the actual evidence and things like that.
Thank you, that's helpful. For instance, there's some commentary to rolling averages in the sort of narrative of the report, but then the graphs are not of the rolling averages, are they, when we look at the graphs? Is that correct? The graphs are the actual numbers, not the rolling average?
That's correct. They reflect the tables.
Yeah, so
Totals,
the graphs are reflecting the totals, but there's some comment about rolling average. So, yeah, thank you for clarifying that. That's great. In terms of looking at trends, is it helpful to look at the number of attacks per dog registered, or is it helpful to look at the attacks per population, or what's a helpful measure to look at a trend, do you think, rather than just the number?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Councillor. From some of the data I've noticed in my time as a team leader is it's previously reflected that unregistered dogs were causing a lot of our dog attacks.
Yeah.
So we put a lot of effort in that space to get dogs registered and try and educate people at that point in their responsibilities around controlling their dogs, keeping them confined, how they walk them on lead, off lead, etc. I think it's starting to shift a bit now as people are returning to work in terms of how we approach that and how it's reported on. Yeah, I think the lack of socialisation over the past 3 years is a high contributing factor to increase in dog attacks across the country.
Yeah, thank you. I know. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Yeah, I could just clarify. I think certainly the team will take on board the questions and the feedback for the preparation of the next annual report. But if there was a request for a more interpretive report before the next annual report, then I think that would require a resolution.
Councillor McCarlid.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I had 3 questions, but I think one of them has been answered already around infringements being waived. Around prosecution on page 34, 1.13. You mentioned that there were no prosecutions brought before the courts in the year 21-22. How does that compare with other years? I just want to fill some gaps in my understanding of this.
Yeah, we don't often, well, at the moment, we haven't recently held any prosecutions. I think our last prosecution was 3 years ago. And in that case, we had 2 back-to-back as well.
Appendix 2 has got the number of prosecutions over the last 5 years.
So I might have missed it. In terms of community outreach and education, you mentioned that this was either cancelled or delayed due to COVID restrictions. Is that resumed?
So we're reaching out to schools again, trying to get in there, make plans for that, and seeing how we can make it more appealing to them to get in there. With the list of public events that have come out, we'll be working with the marketing communications team to see where we can fit into those to reach the best audiences.
Last question. So the people that you're trying to reach in the community, is it largely, are they largely just schools, or what's your range?
Yeah. The reason for approaching schools is generally information we give to the children, they'll take home and give to their parents. So we're kind of getting 2 targets in one go. They're hopefully going to take that with them for a lifetime. And we're trying to reduce the amount of attacks that happen on children, because I think everyone would agree they're quite horrific when they happen. And then the education at the events is just trying to get a broad audience, being dog owners, non-dog owners, people who like animals and don't like animals.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Thank you for the report. I have got a few questions that relate to the unregistered dogs. Now, I see the number has more than doubled since last year, and the commentary on page 39 says that the increase in unregistered dogs can be attributed to the COVID lockdown in August, September. Now, I'm just trying to understand how the COVID lockdown would increase the number of unregistered dogs. Is that a process that can happen online or not?
More during the COVID lockdown, there was an influx of people adopting dogs, and not everyone knows they need to register their dogs, so it's taking us time to catch up and find these people to get their dogs registered.
And how do you identify unregistered dogs other than when other people report that?
Most of them are identified during complaints that are logged with council or patrols that council do in public places.
Okay. Now, on page 34, it talks about the number of infringements that were given, the infringements, 108 of them were for unregistered dogs. What is the cost? What is the infringement cost if someone has an unregistered dog?
The infringement fee is $300.
And is that more or less than a year's registration?
It's more.
More. And so do you think that's enough of a deterrent for people if they actually opted not to register their dog? Do you think that level of infringement is enough of a deterrent or incentive to register?
For the honest people who don't know, yes.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think, yeah, I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Councillor Finlay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Most of my questions have been asked. I've just got two. And on page 33, when you're talking about your in 1.10, when you're talking about your impounded dogs, 38 or 11% were rehomed, and some of those to the SPCA. But the 17% that were euthanised, there's obviously a criteria or a set there that this dog should go to the SPCA, that should be euthanised. Is that a public criteria, or can you elaborate on that at all?
So we do have a behavioural assessment check sheet that we go through, and it assesses the dog on what it's like in its kennel, out of its kennel, on a lead, off a lead, with people running up to it,
Okay.
all number of things.
So you actually do test the dog as someone running up to it, etc.?
Every dog, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. And the other question is that once the dog has gone to the SPCA, and it shouldn't happen, but if it did, and its previous owner came up, do they still have a claim on the dog once it's at the SPCA or not?
No, so we wouldn't give the dog to the SPCA until it became the property of councils.
Okay. So therefore they got no claim?
No.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Jason, and thanks, Ross. Couple questions here. Do we track the number of dog owners?
Yes, that should be on the table in Appendix 2, I believe.
Yeah, sorry, I might have missed it down the end. Following from that, can you tell us if the dog ownership increase, or the number of dogs increasing is more amongst preferred owners or non-preferred owners? Do we know that?
Not today, but I can probably look that up for you. And in general, someone becomes an owner and then applies for preferred ownership. I probably can find some stats around how many preferred owners are obtaining new dogs.
Thank you. Second question that I have is just around the community outreach and education, kind of follows on from Councillor Michalid's questions. So it seemed that my read of section 1.16 was that there was kind of that drop of the events and that sort of thing, but then there's a big increase in the number of site visits. With the kind of events turning back on, is that going to drop off the capacity around number of site visits in the future, or are you hoping to maintain that high level of site visits?
I'm hoping to maintain that because it's had such a positive impact.
Can you give us, said like there's a 31% increase there, but how many site visits are we seeing in a year now?
So every complaint we get generally has a site visit, and that's to try and provide education and reduce the amount of complaints we're getting, and increase owners' knowledge around dog ownership.
Great, thank you. Final question is, are there any internal kind of goals or standards around timeliness of response to issues, or timeliness of kind of overall resolution of issues and tracking of that?
Our processes do have targeted, or KPIs, if you will. With the likes of dog attacks, they're a lot more involved, so generally they take a bit longer to do. We do aim to get everything done in a timely manner. Things aren't just left to sit.
Thanks. I guess what I'm trying to understand there is there already some data that you collect internally around kind of timeliness type things that could be included in future reports, or would that be kind of additional data that you would need to collect on what's happening through your team?
It'll be additional, yeah.
Thank you. I think that's me. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you,
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Sorry for popping back in. It's just, I just wanted to ask about workload. I see that the number of dogs has increased quite a lot. You've said that every complaint gets a site visit, every attack is investigated, the number of attacks is increased. How is the resourcing for the work looking? Like, is the team a bit stretched, or is the capacity? Because if we keep getting increases in dog numbers like this, then I'm just wondering whether we're adequately resourced. May not be a question necessarily for you, but for whoever wants to answer it.
We'll refer that question over to Kerry Lee to answer.
Thank you.
Morning, councillors. Kerry Lee Probert, Acting Chief Customer Officer. I would make the point that additional to the workload of regarding the dogs, the situation that we have generally in terms of staff covering other responsibilities does have an impact. Jason is covering 2 positions at the moment, and Ross himself is also, while also being the team leader, is also very heavily involved in the ozone replacement project. So it's not only the increase in the number of dogs, the number of dog taxis, those peripheral issues that do have an impact on the team.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Sorry, just also following on from Kerry Lee's explanation there. For resourcing, when we look in terms of resourcing, it's not just filling positions or anything like that. It's actually having the knowledge and experience within the team itself and building the capabilities of the team. So, yeah, it's one thing to look at the numbers and things like that, but it's actually having that experience within the team as well that we've got to take into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely understand that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason and Ross. There's no further questions. So I'll move that Council receive the report of the dog control policy and practices for the Palmerston North City Council 2020-2021 pursuant to Section 10A of the Dog Control Act 1996, seconded by Councillor Hancock. And we've just got a second recommendation which will pop up, that future reports include information on timeliness of dog control activities, and that is moved by Councillor Barrett and seconded by Councillor Beattie. Councillor Barrett, do you want to make a comment on that?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Happy to briefly introduce that and certainly acknowledge the officer's comment that they were going to take a lot of the feedback on board from this and didn't necessarily need direction. That was in response to Councillor Johnson. When I asked about timeliness, the officers did indicate that that would be additional data that would need to be collected and additional effort there. And so I did want to make that available to them as a clear signal, should it pass, that we as a council would like some information coming in around the timeliness of dog control activities. I've left that quite open because I think simply at this stage it would be useful to understand what could be brought to us in terms of timeliness information, and that we could work to improve the report from there. But the basic reason for putting this up as an additional recommendation is because it would require additional effort from the team to make it clear that we're hoping to see that. I think what we've seen over the years is some ebb and flow in terms of what's in the report, and it'd be useful to have some clarity on this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just clarify, when you reference timeliness, though you've said it's reasonably open, but I guess is the desire that it would be measured against internal KPIs as a reference?
I mean, I don't want to do the officers' work for them, but I think that would be a logical place to start, is if you've got some internal data that could be supplied, that would, be a sensible starting point.
Okay, thank you. Can I just check with Kerry Lee that your team would understand how to interpret that recommendation? Yeah, great. We will open up for comments on recommendation 1 and 2. Councillor Naylor.
Madam Chair, I think the recommendation should say 2021-22 because the report is talking about the practices for 21-22, and that's the data that's been provided?
We'll just clarify with the authors.
The top of page 30 clarifies.
Yeah, we'll amend that, thanks. Did you want to make a comment?
No, that was all. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I did want to make a couple of comments. The first one is, I just really want to commend the animal management team, who I think have really lifted their game over the previous few years. And I get a lot of positive feedback from the community about the skill and experience of the dog control officers. And I think it's a difficult area to be working in, often with dangerous dogs and their owners. And, the fact that roaming dogs and barking dog complaints have reduced, I think is entirely attributable to the work of the team. And to do that in the face of increasing dog numbers, I think is quite impressive. And the other thing I wanted to draw attention to was the increase in the number of animals that are being rehomed through the pound. So that's increased year on year. And again, that takes quite a lot of effort in terms of assessing dogs and working with potential new owners to get a good match. So, all of that is good work that's going on. And that's in a sort of a background of increased pressure on the team through being expected to cover for other roles, as well as increasing dog numbers. So, a big commendation from me to the team. Secondly, just about the report, I understand that the report is like a statutory report under the Act, but I think councillors certainly have appreciated a little bit more fullness to the statistics, and often use the report as a bit of a picture of how we're doing on dog control. And so I think having just a little bit more interpretation, and as Ross plainly showed, there's good understanding in the team about some of the reasons for trends, and to have that in the report would be helpful, I think, to elected members. And I certainly concur with his analysis about some of the behavioural issues that are coming as a result of lack of socialisation, and that, unfortunately, that lasts for the lifetime of the dog, so that's going to be an issue ongoing, I think, for the whole next few years. And then just finally, I think that although it's helpful to have some graphs in the report, I think if the report's referring to a rolling average, it would be helpful to have a graph of the rolling average, so that the numbers that are being referred to are visual, rather than have the rolling average discussed in the report, but then the graph being of the actual numbers. So just to sort of marry those things up. But it is still a very useful report, and it's helpful for us knowing how things are trending. So thank you to all involved.
Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to echo some of the comments from Councillor Johnson. I think that this is a good report in the sense that it's good for us to have the data and have the numbers, and to acknowledge the work that the animal control team does. I think that they do a fantastic job, but I do also want to, I guess, point out that you can read these numbers in different ways. And so, as an example, I'm one of the dog owners that ended up getting 2 puppies during lockdown, and spent the last 2 years trying to train one of my aggressive dogs. And she's only just been let out of the house in the last month. So I feel like there's a whole, I guess, community of dogs out there that have not been sufficiently socially trained, I guess, or they haven't had that socialization. And the other issue that we've had over the last couple of years is that it's been really hard to get dog trainers in the city. And so even trying to train them has been difficult. So I think those are the kind of, I guess, points that it would be nice to have alongside this, bearing in mind that officers didn't want to put too much anecdotal information in. But it would be interesting to see how these numbers stack up with, I guess, the rest of the country, and how everybody else is experiencing these kind of dog problems as well. But I did want to say a massive thank you to the team for the work that they're doing, because it is not easy dealing with aggressive dogs, even when they're your own. So a massive thank you to the team for that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yep, absolutely, Totoko, the comments already made. I just wanted to acknowledge the high level of community interest in this particular piece of work that Council does in animal management and welfare, and recognise the difficult role that our officers play in managing those sometimes conflicting community aspirations between people who own dogs, and some of those dogs being dangerous and menacing dogs, and the people, general members of the public who might or might not be dog owners, who interact with those people and those dogs. And that is, you're working in an environment which by its nature is full of conflict, and that's a difficult and stressful environment to work in. And the community satisfaction figures taken in that context, I think, are actually very impressive, and that was why I wanted to ask about them. And I want to commend you also for your work in that space. Thank you.
Councillor Finlay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just like to thank the officers for the report. It's a very good report. And also just like to comment that the officers are working under an increased workload in an environment which is well below standard. And I think they're doing a pretty marvellous job. As a dog owner, I appreciate their work, and I just would like to make sure that our dog rangers, if you like, are well looked after, because they probably come across more abuse from the public than any other employee in the city. And just want to let them know that we do acknowledge that and thank them for their work. Thank you,
Councillor. Yes, I don't think many other staff probably have a job description that includes having to rush towards a dog to test a reaction. So thank you, and thank you for the report. We've got no further elected members in the queue to speak. Councillor Barrett, would you like to respond as a right of reply to your recommendation? Great. We will look to vote. That has carried 100%. Moving on to item 8, the wastewater discharge consent project progress update. This is on page 43, and we've got Mike Monaghan, Group Manager of Three Waters, to present this.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Mike Monaghan aho. Good morning, Madam Chair and councillors. I'm pleased this morning to present to you this formal update on the progress to date of the wastewater discharge consent programme. I would like to take the paper as read, however there's a few things I'd like to just comment on. Firstly, to draw your attention just to the enormous amount of work that has happened since our last update, which was back in May, particularly around some of the major work packages. The river modelling work has seen significant progress, with the results indicating that a significant improvement in the quality of the downstream environment can be expected. The land testing, although challenging, was completed with access available to test the major soil types. But most probably the most exciting work to date has been the completion of the wastewater treatment plant design concept and the subsequent wet weather modelling. These work packages, progressing in parallel, are all vital components feeding into and helping to refine the consent strategy, which is an iterative process. So before I open the floor for questions, I would like to share a very quick 2-minute video clip, which is a rendered 3D model and a flyover of what the concept of the new treatment plant might look like. Oh, do I do it? Technophobe. Click play. I'm pressing the play button. Oh, here we go. Right. Well, my laser pointer's disappeared, but that's okay. What we can see is the you can see the existing plant. It's a brownfield site, so we're not moving to a new site. We're building on the existing plant. And let me see if I can make this work. Anyway, on the right there, that's going to be the new activated sludge reactors, and we're flying now over the micro filtration plant that will be built. The lagoons there that you can see in focus now, they will not be part of the process anymore, but they have been designed to be wet weather attenuation ponds. So any storm events, the excess flow will be stored in those lagoons. We're just following down the existing plant, but you can see the primary sedimentation process has been increased by 25% to include another process, and grit removal and fine screening is also included in the concept design. That's a wide shot. We can see the existing digesters and the existing primary plant. And as we fly over, that's the major part of it there, that big, large rectangular tank that you can see there. That's the activated biological nutrient removal process, which would be called the Bardenpho system. The back end of the plant there, we can see increased chemical storage for the phosphorus removal process, and that large shed that you can see there will be the disinfection process before the pump station, which then transports the highly treated wastewater off-site to its final destinations, which, as you know, is both river and land, depending on the time of year and the river flow conditions. So yeah, that's very, very quick overview of what the plant will look like, or likely to look like. That's the concept at this stage. So hopefully you found that a little bit interesting. So yeah, thank you, councillors. I will just point out that you'll notice I'm flying solo today. I don't have the technical, the programme technical lead with me, so I'll do my very best to answer any questions, and I'll open the floor to questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. First question is from Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. The only question I've got, Mike, is are we on track to lodge this consent in December?
Yes, is the simple answer. There's an awful lot of work going in to ensure that we're on track. But yeah, all the indications so far is that the work packages are coming together, and we are expecting to lodge on time.
Perfect. Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just in 1.1 of the report, it talks about the adaptive management approach that was adopted, and reducing the amount of wastewater generated by the city. Is there any work currently underway to progress that resolution?
Yeah, the adaptive management strategy has been developed to be lodged as part of the consent, but there's a lot of work that's happening with there's a number of groups that meet together to discuss, potential adaptive management strategies. We've had meetings with biosolids experts from Auckland. We've also got somebody from Hunter H2O, which is a large Australian company, presenting to us next month, where they've brought in adaptive management techniques to address the water shortage issues and things like that. So there's a lot of work going on which is feeding into the strategy. So where would that be reflected in the work streams? I couldn't see anything to do with that in the report in terms of the work streams that are currently underway.
Have I missed that somewhere?
There is an adaptive management work stream, which looks like it's not, I can't see in the report either, but I'll get back to you on that and give you some information on that.
Okay, and so will that just be included in the next report, or would we need to seek further information to understand what's happening in that space?
We'll include it in the next report for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, Mike. I've just got a couple of questions. Just wondering if you could actually expand on the comment around access to private land has slowed progress. Is there any further commentary we could actually add to that to flesh it out a bit?
I think the soil testing phase, which happened a couple of months ago now, was took longer than we'd anticipated, trying to get access to the sites that were identified for soil testing. I think that comment is probably based around that statement. The team did get access to the properties that they needed to in the end to test the types of soil they needed to test, but it did slow that phase of the work down a little bit.
Okay, then perhaps sort of on the same topic there, I'm just seeking a little bit of clarification around paragraph 2.6 on page 45. The 3 soil types that we're obviously seeking, have we been able to identify those on the locations that we've tested to date?
Yes.
We have, thank you. And the last question I've got, page 47, paragraph 2.17, is there any update from the Horizons workshop? There's reference there that was a workshop to be, and I think it's sort of fallen between the time that the report was actually written and today, so I was just wondering if there's any update on that.
Sorry, I don't have an update today. I know there is a presentation, or perhaps the CIO would like to comment on that.
Through the chair, yes, we've presented to Horizons elected members, but we have also had a specific discussion with the consents team at Horizons. We're presenting tomorrow to the River Accord at Horizons, but we have had that technical detail conversation. Horizons are also attend the Adaptive Management Group as an observer, so they're across where we are, but we're starting those really detailed questions to help them plan their workload when the consent gets lodged.
Great, thanks. That's very helpful. Thanks, Mike. Madam Chair.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mike, for the report. My questions are about the project risk and the table on page 50. So, yeah, pleased to see that the unmitigated risk moves from major to moderate with the mitigations the team have put in place. And I think we're all mostly concerned about the looming December date for the application. But I was also concerned about the commentary around insufficient budget that indicates that budgets have been moved around to focus on getting that piece of work done. And I just wanted to find out from you if that risk will remain at moderate or if we actually are likely to run into higher risk around the budget for this project.
Yeah, that is a major focus for us at the moment. You'll appreciate that the original budgets were built around a June lodgement, and now we're going for a December lodgement, which means there's an extra 6 months of work for the whole team. But forecasts are, our forecasts are sort of predicting that we'll be close, but possibly, well, we're bringing a paper. I think it's fair to say we'll be bringing a paper to council on the 28th, I believe, to talk about that.
Sarah Sinclair, Chief Infrastructure Officer. Sorry, I forgot that last time. Yeah, we'll be bringing a paper to Finance and Audit about the budgets to seek a bit more.
Thank you. I don't think I want to say thank you for that, but okay.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Mike, for the report and being available for questions. A couple questions that I do have. How do we know when a consent application is ready to file?
That's an interesting one for me, because my experience is, I don't have a vast amount of experience with that, but we do have a very experienced team working on it for us. So we'll be getting a draft version of the consent, which the timeline that we'd expect that towards the end of October. And I think at that stage we'll be doing a full assessment as a technical team to make sure that the consent is ready for lodgement.
It looks like there may be further comment, Madam Chair.
Through the Chair, Sarah Sinclair, Chief Infrastructure Officer. The team has been talking about how we allow enough time for elected members to see the draft consent and talk about what's included in it. We're very conscious that the time frame does impact against the post-election process. So we're assuming that potentially some sort of briefing or workshop would occur to enable elected member input to answer that broader question of how do we know when it's ready. The consent strategy that's been developed has been an iterative process, because we know that when we submit the consent to Horizons, it needs to be considered to be complete enough to be processed. If not, they'll simply reject it. So there's been an enormous amount of work on how we get to the point of providing enough information, because it is a very tight deadline. Thankfully, it's moved by 6 months, so we've got more ability to provide information, but it is a very tight deadline to make sure the consent is good enough to be lodged successfully.
Thank you. If I can follow up briefly around that, I guess I'm hearing one part of that answer around, making sure it's to a standard that it doesn't get rejected on day one. And I realize it's a little bit hard to understand what the upper bound of quality of a consent might be, but within that kind of band of, outright rejection on day one through to the best resource consent that ever went in, can I understand where we're aiming for and how we're validating if we're there before we lodge?
Through the Chair, that is a really, really good question. So we are aiming for, the starting point is we all appreciate that wastewater and the disposal of it, no matter how highly treated, is a contentious issue, and no one wants treated wastewater near them or the things that they value. So our starting point is we know that after the consent is lodged, there will be a technical assessment, and then there will also be hearings where people who object to the consent come to the hearing to put their point forward about the recommendations that are being made and the mitigations that are being put forward. What we've been striving to do through the whole consent is to work with the people who may object. We're not trying to limit their ability to object, but we're trying to understand from a really early stage what their objections might be and whether we can mitigate them. That's what the adaptation groups are for. That's why we're seeking co-design with iwi, as well as the sort of traditional cultural impact assessments and stuff like that. We're really seeking to understand what people's objections will be in the specific and how we can make sure that what we do mitigates. It might not mitigate how they feel about it, but it might mitigate what we can in the technical side, which we hope would then reduce or at least sort of allow us to anticipate the objections. So we're aiming for good enough quality that, although we appreciate we'll get objections, and we will go through a hearing process, we can say that we've understood where people are coming from and built it into what we're doing.
Thank you. That's helpful. The final question that I have, the report signals taking what I think is called a global consent strategy, which is not identifying specific land, but identifying that land will be identified. Have we tested the kind of impact on consentability of going down a global path versus a more specific path?
Well, I'll have a first crack at it, and then Sarah will hopefully fill in the gaps. But yes, that will be part of the strategic conversation with Horizons, but also with our consenting team from our lead consultants. That they're sort of exploring those, I guess, those topics now, I suppose.
So to follow up, I mean, it seems the kind of precedents around us, from my memory, and I may be wrong on this, but from my memory, precedents around us did have specific parcels of land identified. And again, I'm trying to understand, how are we validating whether or not doing this global approach sort of increases the challenges that we'll face in getting consent, or does it, in fact, not have any impact at all on the chances?
I might ask Sarah to pick that one.
Yeah, so Sarah Sinclair, Chief Infrastructure Officer, through the chair. One of the issues that the consent strategy has been seeking to deal with is the fact that we are seeking this consent 8 years before, 6 to 8 years before the current consent expires. So one of the challenges that we have is that once we start identifying land, it moves council into a process of either acquisition or designation or things like that. So we're seeking to balance the impact on people through striving to make sure that the consent recognises that we won't identify and try and secure all of the land that's needed when the consent is lodged, that it will give council or the DIA or whoever owns the water entity into the future time to acquire land. That means that we do have to be able to give some flexibility to how land is identified in the consent, and the impacts of using that land are identified in the consent. The conversations we've had with Horizons so far have indicated that they do acknowledge that having a global assessment of where could and couldn't be consented is broadly acceptable. Part of the discussions we're having at the moment is whether we would need to secure 1 or 2 specific sites, or at least identify specific sites that we intend to secure more quickly to enable them to then apply the global consent process to something. Those conversations are ongoing, so we haven't got a specific answer on that yet from Horizons. And what we're striving to do is to, I guess, that is one of the mitigations that we're striving to achieve in how we moderate the impacts over time.
Okay, thank you both, Madam Chair.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mike. I'm a little bit more confused after getting this many questions and answer. But a workshop with the consenting officers and then a follow-up workshop. My understanding is these workshops, do we still don't know what actually is required with this consent application?
No, I think we're clear on what's required for the consent application.
I think the purpose of the workshops and the engagement with Horizons to date has just been around communication and keeping communication lines open in terms of where the process is up to. Is that correct, Mike?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave it there then.
Councillor Hancock.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks for letting me come back into the queue. just really, I just want to pick up on Councillor Barrett's line of questioning just around consent lodgement. How do we know that we're actually ready? I suppose I'm just looking for a little bit of reassurance. I note that paragraph 3, page 47, we've been using Mike McDonald as the council peer reviewer. So when we actually get our consent, I suppose, to a point where we think it might be ready, I'm just seeking some understanding whether or not peer review will actually be part of that process before lodgement.
I don't know. Actually, I think I might just ask Sarah about who we've engaged for that peer review process.
Through the chair, some of the peer reviews are already happening. Mott's aren't our only peer reviewer. People like Simpson Grierson are peer reviewers. So some of the peer reviews are happening as they go. We're not leaving them all to the end. They're happening as the pieces of work are complete, so that we're not caught in a very tight end programme. Does that answer your question, Councillor Hancock, or not?
Yeah, I suppose there has to be an element of flying the plane while we're still building it. So I assume that some of this is still unknown. Would that be correct?
Yeah, not everything's going to be delivered at the very last minute. So we've tried to make sure that everything's delivered as early as possible, so it can be peer reviewed as early as possible, so the feedback can go in, so that we get to that ultimate point of everything being ready, reviewed, good to go.
Thank you, Cheers. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mike and Sarah, for the questions. There's no further questions. Thank you for the report. So I'll move that the committee note the progress update on the wastewater discharge consenting program, seconded by Councillor Hancock. I'll open up for any comments. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. It's been good to get this report and particularly hear the answers to the questions today. I think the one part that I look forward to hearing more about in the next report is having a better understanding of that adaptive management approach. And I think it's really important that we get onto this as soon as possible. If there are, key ways that we can reduce the amount of wastewater generated by the city or find other beneficial uses for waste, then that will have a direct impact on things like how much land might actually be required. So I do think that aspect, that direction that was given and that aspect of this overall project, we need to ensure that we don't lose sight of that and actually bring that as part of one of the work streams that happens as soon as possible.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to Mike and Sarah for the report and the responses to questions. Very much at the sharp end of the largest and most ambitious infrastructure consenting that we have undertaken probably ever in this city, and it is understandable that there is some concern both from council and the wider community about how we're going in this journey. It's a journey that started quite a while back, actually, and I'm quite looking forward to reaching the end of it. There's hugely significant community interest around this and community impacts around this in terms of how this actually plays out. I think I would hope that we are in a position where we do lodge a consent which is not only on time, but of a very high standard and is well received by Horizons, and certainly endorse the officer's approach around trying to pre-socialize and work with key stakeholders to ensure that we are on as positive a footing when we get into that space as we can, because getting the consent together is a challenge. Getting the consent is a monumental challenge, and that's the real challenge that we do face. At the center of this is the health of our river and ensuring that we make the investment in a way that does ensure that we have that improvement in the health of our river and the health of our environment. provided for this community alongside the capacity to continue to thrive as a city into the future. So an absolutely critical and fundamental piece of infrastructure consenting. And I wish the officers well. I know those of us around this table all have a little diary right now where we're counting off the number of days until the 8th of October. You will have a diary, no doubt, counting off the number of days until the end of the year, and I wish you well in making the very best of all those days so that we can have this consent in as strong a position as possible. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Very nice summary. There is no one else in the queue to speak, so I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 100%. Moving on to item 9, the committee work schedule on page 53, and I'll refer to Chief Planning Officer David Murphy to speak to that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple of brief comments in relation to the items with some read through them. The first item, there's been good progress made on the identification of the priority routes, not just for heavy vehicles, but for all modes, and I appreciate there's been some anticipation for this report, given the impact heavy vehicles particularly having on the transport network and other modes. The report, there was 2 reports being worked on. Unfortunately, the 2 staff were impacted by COVID, one after the other, and there were some strong interrelationships between the 2. There has been some good work made, progress made on the options to enforce those routes as well, but it wasn't quite ready for committee, so it will be prioritised after the election in the next term. So that's item 1. Item 3, I can confirm that there is conversations continuing between the strategic planning team and the infrastructure team, and that report will, the critical timing for that report really is to ensure that that is reported before the hearing for the Okotiri plan change, and that we will need a decision on those programs before heading into that hearing. And lastly, item 4 was delayed due to some delays in getting feedback from New Zealand Police and the external legal review. So that will be going, it's being finalised at the moment, and will be going direct to Council on the 5th of October.
Thank you, David. Councillors, are there any questions? Great, you've covered that well, thank you. So we've got a recommendation in front of us. The committee resolves that the Planning and Strategy Committee receive its work schedule dated September 2022. I'll move that, seconded by Councillor Hancock. Are there any comments? Great, I'll invite you to vote. And that has carried 100%. Just before we wrap up, I just want to make a couple of acknowledgements. Firstly, to Sarah, Carly, Hannah, and previously Susanna, who supported the administration of this committee. To you, David, and your team, Jono, Mike, in particular Julie and Peter as well, who often appear through our reporting. And then to the wider staff, and I guess in particular from your team, Sarah, Kathy, Mike and Bryce, who also make regular appearances here. And finally to you, Pat, as Deputy Chair, for your support as well. Thank you everyone for participating, and always some good, robust